Hey everyone, it's Thorn, and in this video I want to answer a question I got from a viewer, which is what sorts of things are part of my practice that aren't Wiccan? And I thought this was a really interesting question because it's actually, I think, more complicated than it initially sounds. I think that especially on social media and in books, we have this idea that we can delineate things really cleanly. Like, we talk about things like witchcraft, religion, practice, whatever. Like, they are objective things with like really impermeable kind of boundaries. And most of the time they just aren't. So this is a good, I think, exercise in thinking about where some of those boundaries might lie. So I'll talk a little bit about that for me, and hopefully that'll raise some questions for yourself too. So it's weird because I think what makes this question complicated is that in recent years, I mean, really in the last, maybe even really in the last like 5 years, like it's pretty recent, like definitely the last 10 years, it's become more and more prevalent, I think, in our kind of collective magical communities to insist that witchcraft is not a religion, that it is basically like a series of techniques that somebody can choose if they want to kind of like graft onto potentially any number of religions, combine with a religion, etc. And if you've been around for a while, you've heard me kind of talk about why that gets a little bit weird, because like, what even is religion? Like, first we have to answer that question, and most of the time people don't make that attempt. But if we think that witchcraft is a thing that is necessarily separate and it's an additional thing, then we need to think kind of definitively about like what things are witchcraft, like what techniques are witchcraft. And that gets nebulous real fast too. Wicca occupies a particularly weird space because, unlike other sorts of witchcraft, Wicca is very explicitly a religious type of witchcraft, which means that from the Wiccan's perspective, what we are doing is necessarily witchcraft. When you practice Wicca, you are practicing witchcraft, like full stop. That's a Wiccan perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other types of witchcraft, of course, but from our perspective, participating in our rites, our rituals, the way we interact with our gods, like those things necessarily entail witchcraft and are acts of witchcraft. So it gets weird when we try to pick out like where we might have like individual pieces of that and disassemble them. But certainly can be done because I think that there are certain things that I engage in that I think just objectively are not a part of witchcraft as a whole. They are things that developed and existed outside of not just Wicca, but witchcraft as a whole. And I'm thinking about things like astrology, right, and herbalism, stuff that it's very typical to see in witchcraft spaces. But if you look at the histories of these individual things, and if you look at the people who practice them, while there might be overlap in witchcraft spaces, these things are not in and of themselves witchcraft. There are loads and loads of astrologers in the world. Most of them aren't witches. You know, the typical person at the farmer's market, like talking about herbalism, is not a witch. Your average tarot reader, probably not a witch. But we tend to think of those things, I think, kind of as part of that. So kind of thinking about those things. So some very specific things that I practice kind of in that vein. First of all, I'm going to talk about tarot, because tarot is a really big piece of my magical life. And it's kind of a funny thing because my initial interest in tarot certainly came through being Wiccan. I think there's kind of an assumption in our communities as a whole that like, as a witch, at some point, you will have to learn some kind of divination. And for most people, that's tarot, because tarot, I think, is kind of this ubiquitous everywhere thing. Increasingly, I think that's changing as people discover other sorts of techniques, but particularly in the 90s, it was just kind of an assumed thing. And if you look at a lot of beginner witchcraft books and beginner Wicca books, there's very frequently a chapter in there that's like tarot meanings or whatever. So I started learning about tarot kind of as an extension of being Wiccan, but tarot very quickly led me elsewhere from a magical perspective. The way I practice and think about tarot is very heavily linked to the Golden Dawn and Western esotericism broadly. So for me, tarot becomes not even really a divination tool. I mean, of course it's a divination tool and I use it that way, but that's not the primary way that I use tarot. For me, tarot is kind of like a body of shared symbols that makes it possible for me to understand and have conversations with magicians in other traditions. It's kind of like, it's like having a shared language in some ways. It's been very useful for helping me understand other magical systems and also to sort of structure the world and how I think about things. And the deeper I got into tarot, I was able to turn around and look at Wicca and go, oh, look at how these things play out in my own tradition. I think for a lot of folks, practicing Wicca for any length of time, it becomes clear pretty quickly that there is a very traceable lineage with like the Western mystery tradition and kind of Western esotericism as a whole. Like you look at Wiccan ritual structure, like you can very clearly see connection to these European traditions that predated. And for me, that link actually happened through tarot. It wasn't something that was just obvious to me until I had several years working with tarot, learning those systems, approaching the Golden Dawn, looking at the Lima, kind of looking at these other systems, having that shared language, turning around, looking at the stuff that I'd been doing for years and going, ah, yes, there are the connections. So my practice of tarot is not Wiccan, but I have used it to understand kind of what I'm up to as a Wiccan. The second thing I want to talk about is herbalism, which I mentioned a little bit earlier too. So when, I'm not an herbalist, okay? But when the pandemic kicked off and other folks were baking bread, I was like, I'm going to make salves. Like I decided that I was going to get like really consciously into my garden. I've always loved plants. My mother was a gardener. Like I understand the joy of like going to pick out new plants and growing things from seed. And I've always had that interest, but it wasn't something that was really consciously a part of my witchcraft practice until much later. And it was really only in the last, I guess, like 3 years or so that I really like consciously was engaging with that in a magical way. And herbalism, as I've said before, is while we often associate witches with herbal healing and kind of the natural world and whatever, those things aren't inherent to witchcraft in the sense that lots of people practice these things without being witches, and there are lots of witches who don't have a practice of herbal magic. So that's been really beneficial. And there isn't anything in Wicca that says that like you have to be an herbalist. But that's been really cool. It's been a way, not just to learn more, I think, but to like build a connection with the area that I live in. Because I spent a lot of time learning about, you know, the plant life that is native to the area, things that have been imported, things that are invasive. Like it's been really cool kind of learning about the things that grow just in my yard and in my area. My husband and I have a fair bit of land, I think, for being suburbanites. So we're pretty lucky, and it's pretty heavily wooded. So there's a lot of opportunity to explore, and there's a lot of magical possibility there as a result. So that's been super duper cool. The last thing, because I don't want to make this too long ever. The last thing is I practice within the framework of other traditions as well. One thing that's also really unique, and this is again why like the category of religion gets like weird and wonky and I think deserves a little bit more care than we usually give it, is I practice multiple religious traditions, which is a lot more common than I think people allow for. We have this idea, I think, particularly in the United States, maybe it's because we're so used to like census forms where you have to like check boxes. We're like deeply uncomfortable when people check multiple boxes. We have this idea that like, if you don't practice the whole religion, you're somehow doing it wrong. And like that by itself is just like hella Protestant, guys. Like it's just whatever. But it's actually like really common and I think really normal to explore other things, practice other things, and lots of people compartmentalize. And that's something that I do. So I practice other traditions of the craft, and I have training in other traditions. But here I want to talk about my involvement in the OTO, because when I moved to this area, one of the things that ended up happening, I was always like Thelema curious. I think just by virtue of being Wiccan, I think like there's a natural connection there just because of there's a shared history and there's shared people. When I moved to this area, I was looking for pagan community and I was really kind of struggling to find like my people. And I found them in the local OTO body. So I got involved. I'm officially affiliated with the OTO. And that's become a significant piece of who I am too in my magical practice. So, you know, I think that that's a thing. We have this idea that folks can only do one thing and be involved in one thing. And a good example of this is, I think, like how various kinds of Catholicism and folk magic are very popular right now, and those are kind of coming to the fore. There are many histories throughout the world where we see people combining traditions, looking at different traditions, kind of doing one thing during the week and another thing on the weekends. Like that's just a thing that I think is part of being human and kind of the, you know, the religious experience. So anyway, that's a whole bunch of stuff that I do that I think of explicitly as not being Wiccan, even though it pretty heavily informs my practice of Wicca. So I hope you all have a good day, and I will see you next time.